I don't know. You said you were nervous that a Cuban and a New Yorker were going to be on a podcast with a boring
Well,
evangelical.
to
I
be
was so
fair,
well behaved. I'll be honest with you. I was so well behaved.
I did not say nervous. I just said I was going to have my work cut out for me for keeping our conversation focused. But you two did very well. I didn't have to pull us back from too many rabbit trails. So this was good. You guys nailed it. Welcome to Crossing Phase, the podcast with a Christian and a Muslim talking religion and politics. Up today with my friend John Pinna and myself, Matt Hawkins, we have our very good friend Kristina Arriaga. Kristina, who, if you're not familiar with, is one of my favorite voices in the religious freedom space and also the human rights space. And Kristina has a little bit of a story to tell us, and we're going to get into that because she recently resigned her position as commissioner on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. We're going to get into what that is and what her concerns are. But first, I just want to welcome her to the program and talk a little bit about her background, and both professionally and personally, and get to know her a bit. Kristina, welcome to Crossing Phase.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big fan of the program, so I'm very excited to be on.
I appreciate it. From maybe our first listener, our qualified, our kind of confirmed listener to the program that's come on as a guest. So John and I really appreciate it. John, how's it going over there? Where are you today?
It's not too bad. I'm in Washington. I'm not in any exotic places, So, and I'm excited to have someone who, regardless of what, it's not right, it's not left, it's not Republican or Democrat, but someone who's standing up for something that's right, and no matter what the consequences are. So, Kristina's, it's exciting to have her on the program.
Yeah. And among Kristina's illustrative career, she was also executive director for a while for a law firm that many religious freedom advocates are familiar with, Beckett Law. And she was there for a number of years, 8 years, I think, Kristina?
22 years.
22 years with Beckett. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was the executive director for the last 7.
Right. Okay. Forgive my math on that. And then you've gone on to do some other things, and including this USCIRF position. But give people a little bit of a sense of your family and your background. Why do you care so much about this thing called religious freedom, and in particular, international religious freedom?
I'm sure you can hear my accent. I'm Cuban American. My father passed away a few years ago. He was Cuban, and he had to go into exile because of Fidel Castro. And my mother is German, and she was in a concentration camp for some of her life.
Goodness.
So we grew up with an enormously strong commitment to freedom and with gratitude to be able to live in the freest country in the world. My father was a great man and a great lover of all things American. He never bought a foreign car. He was so grateful that the United States had welcomed him that he would only drive American-made cars. And he used to tell us all the time when we had no money growing up because both my parents had gone into exile with absolutely nothing. My father didn't speak English when he came to this country. He had to learn. And my mother made do with what we had. But he always said, we're rich people temporarily without any cash. And he was great. He thought that because we lived in the freest country in the world, we were already rich enough and we would make our fortune. And he was able to make enough money to send us to school and everything else. But I loved being able to grow up with that feeling of gratitude for freedom, but also with a duty to defend those freedoms.
Talk to us about what exactly is this thing called USCIRF. It's called the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. I will post kind of an explainer in the show notes, but give folks just kind of the bird's eye view of what this thing is that you were a part of up until recently.
20 years ago, members of Congress started to see that our own State Department, when traveling abroad and when engaging in multilateral negotiations, they were not bringing up religious freedom. They were no longer advocating for individuals who have been incarcerated, detained, tortured because of their religious beliefs. So Congress came up with a brilliant idea. And actually, USCIRF is the only agency in the entire world that does this. USCIRF was created with the mandate of monitoring religious freedom worldwide, making policy recommendations to Congress, the Department of State, and the White House. And the genius of the architects of USCIRF is that they knew bureaucrats do not fight bureaucracy, and they wanted people who would be disruptors. So the agency was created with 9 commissioners who would be unpaid, part-time volunteers and would supervise or direct a staff of about 15 government workers who would then issue reports on countries of particular concern.
Actually, I'd like to interject for a moment. My experience with USCIRF, sort of bare bones, it was back in the reauthorization 2011, 2012. But I think there's a point that you made that let's suss out a little bit. The commissioners in the military is called asymmetrical warfare. There's the independence, the volunteer quality of the commissioners allows them a certain amount of independence to where they're not held by sort of the bureaucratic elements, but also they don't have a job to lose because they're volunteers. And it allows them to be very disruptive. The term you used in the military is called asymmetrical warfare, where you may not be able to attack an issue head on, but you were able to hit the target on multiple areas on the peripherals to the point where you're able to push your cause over the edge. Could you elaborate just a little bit on that? Only because I think it's such an important quality of the commissioners and the independence of the commissioners and the bipartisan quality of the commissioners.
I've seen commissioners write an op-ed, and as a result of that op-ed, a despot country will open a prison door for someone who was in prison unjustly. I have seen a tweet regarding a communist Cuban who was repressing a pastor rattle her in such a way that she has now signaled that she's changing her mind. The ability of commissioners to focus with laser-like precision on religious freedom and be able to speak out about these issues is one of the ways that religious advocacy has advanced in the United States. Let me give you another example.
We can. It's an innovative technology. The idea that was outlined in IRFA, International Religious Freedom Act, for these commissioners. It's just an innovation that is so important, and it speaks to one of the reasons why you resigned. So please elaborate.
Sure. So in my 25 years of advocating for religious freedom, I have found that every time that religious freedom is subject to repression, it's either tyrants or bureaucrats. In other words, sometimes someone like Putin or Erdogan, but sometimes is the zoning commissioner in your state that wants the city to pay more taxes. And because churches, synagogues, mosques don't pay taxes, then they'll push the synagogue or the mosque to give up their land to build a Costco. And many times these bureaucrats abuse the law or use it in their favor. And many times these communities have no idea what their legal rights are. So bureaucrats are tremendously dangerous to our freedom. In Cuba, for instance, after Fidel Castro took over, there was something called the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And that was a person in your block who would make sure that when someone came to visit you, that you had requested the permission from the state, that you knew that this person was also a revolutionary. And this CDR person, Committee for the Defense of the Revolution person, could come into your home and ask you where you purchase your food and ask you for the receipts. This is the person who was in charge of control. And unfortunately, there are a lot of petty bureaucrats in our government that are able to essentially disrupt good things. And instead of working for the mission and enabling the mission, they're people who just want to control you. And unfortunately, I have run across a number of those people in government in Washington.
Well, and it's a unique structure because some people look at USCIRF and then they look at the IRF department in State Department, currently filled by Ambassador Brownback, and they think it's duplicative. Obviously, the three of us here don't see it as duplicative because the USCIRF office still has to wrangle with State Department obligations to include diplomacy, right, in their calculations and in their speech and in their actions as a government entity. Whereas USCIRF, you guys can hit pretty hard and pretty vocally and don't have that restriction. So I think that's part of the unique design as well.
Well, and hold our own institutions accountable. So there's been times when USCIRF has held the State Department accountable, or AID, or the White House accountable for what they say in international religious freedom and what they're supposed to be promoting in alignment with IRFA. So, but let's, Kristina, hit us back. I'm excited that you're here. And you're schooling us on all this on this most recent event with USCIRF.
One of the most moving moments I had while serving as commissioner was being in another country with the minister in charge of religion, with Republican and Democrat colleagues. And this is right after the president was elected. And the minister asked a Republican appointee, what will you do if President Trump doesn't live up to his campaign promises? And the Republican appointee said, well, then we'll criticize him. And this minister was absolutely shocked that someone would criticize people from their own party. And the beauty of democracy is precisely that commissioners in the past have stood up for what was right and have criticized members of their own parties for not defending those around the world who suffer, who die, who are persecuted for their religious freedom. Understanding that religious freedom is not a tool, that religious freedom is important for peace and for global stability, that religious freedom is a canary in the coal mine. If religious freedom dies, we know for a fact from a lot of research that the country that is repressing people who live according to their deeply held convictions is heading into the direction of instability. So the fact that commissioners are appointed by the Republicans and the Democrats and they criticize their own party is one of the beautiful things that make USCIRF so spectacular. That's something that the Department of State, understandably, could not do, but we as commissioners at USCIRF could do.
So that brings us, I think, to the next question, which is, you wrote in the Wall Street Journal recently why you're leaving the commission. So if you believe the commission is as important as it is, and that you've seen action as a commissioner do some really good things for some really persecuted people, let's get into why you left. What, from your vantage point, were you seeing? I think a lot of this comes from the Senate, but you have eyes and ears in other places. So walk us through your recent departure.
The hallmark of USCIRF is the ability for commissioners to tweet and to op-ed without permission slips from a bureaucracy like the Department of State. And I saw two things happening at the same time. First issue is that the Senate drafted a bill, and that was introduced by Senators Rubio, Coons, Durbin, and Gardner.
Yeah.
Had shackled commissioners, made the government watchdog into a government lapdog, and unilaterally gave the ability for the staff at USCIRF to sue commissioners with the power of the United States government behind them.
Right.
The bill was absurd. It was ridiculous. It reminded me of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And not a single Republican or Democrat commissioner had seen the bill before it was presented only a few days before markup. And as you know, a reauthorization means a piece of legislation that makes it possible for an agency to continue because it provides funding. It oftentimes has serious changes. And those pieces of legislation normally are debated. They're normally hearings. None of that happened before this bill came forward. So that was issue number one, that substantively the bill shackled the commissioners. Issue number two was very grave, and that is that it extended the mission of USCIRF, and therefore it diluted it altogether. And it extended it with words that sound but are code for something else. The Senate called for the commission to monitor abuse of religion in order to violate human rights. And my friends, that means, for instance, John, that a commissioner who was ideological opposed to Islam, for instance, could accuse Islam of violating the rights of children because of their circumcision practices. Same with the Jewish tradition. Mm-hmm. And Matt, as a conservative Christian, as an evangelical, the USCIRF could come after a church that you pastored abroad if you, for instance, violated, quote unquote, the rights of the LGBTQ plus community.
Oh.
Right. So someone could bring a pig into a halal butchery and say you're violating my religious freedom by not slaughtering it.
Absolutely. But worse than that, USCIRF has the megaphone of the most powerful country in the world. So This is not just a private citizen saying, for instance, in Germany, that the Jewish community should no longer be allowed to circumcise their children. This is the U.S. government allowing it to intrude and essentially violate the religious freedom rights of individuals. There's something to understand, and that is that religious freedom protects people. It doesn't protect religion. And religious freedom is not about who God is. It's about who we are. Human beings are born with the right to search for the truth. And whether that truth takes them to organized religion or no religion at all, it should be free from government intervention. And by introducing the abuse of religion clause in the mandate of the commission, the loophole it created would violate religious freedom. And that is something I could not sit on my hands and watch that happen.
And we've seen this happen before with this, like as I always talked about, the sister organization USCIRF, United States Institute for Peace, where they're talking about so many different subjects. There's, and maybe this is controversial, so maybe I shouldn't say it. But the point is what USCIRF is to religion, USCIRF is to war, right? The United States Institute for Peace. And it is broad because it's peace. But there's been so many subjects that even here in the Beltway, a lot of us joke about, well, what are they talking about? And all they do is talk about issues, but they don't have that same laser focus that USCIRF has. But I also think there's another element here is that, this is a founding principle of our country, religious freedom. And the whole point of the IRFA and one of the key components and the reasons why it's such a bipartisan issue was passed was because it is a founding principle that has the sort of true tenets of freedom, whether it's to choose, believe, not believe, and be your own person religiously. And if you start it's called mission creep. All right, yeah. The term. So if you start adding in and stacking different issues, you end up talking about a lot of things but doing nothing. And is that a fair assessment of the nervousness that you have with this new addition, the loophole, as you call it?
It's more than mission creep. It is a way to destroy the commission from within by introducing ideological arguments into an agency that until now has operated largely as one of the last places in Washington where you can have true bipartisanship. In the last 3 years, I have never, not once, experienced any partisanship. And you know what they say about Washington, right? Washington is Hollywood for the ugly. There are a lot of people with big egos, and there are a lot of people who are driven solely by their political affiliation. That was not the case at USCIRF, and that's also what made it a powerful agency. The Senate, not only in the expansion of the mission, but also in the way that it wants to control commissioners, even attending meetings, will essentially destroy any strength that came from nonpartisanship.
Okay, and the staff issue you mentioned has been going on for years. I remember for the last 10 years, the staff has always tried to exert authority over the commissioners. And because the volunteer nature of the commissioners and the bipartisan diversity and faith diversity, it's been very difficult because it's not controlled like an agency bureau, like at the Department of State. So, can you speak a little bit about how the difference in how unique that quality is of the commissioners and their independence from staff?
Sure. I'll give you an example. of a story of something that happened to me. I mean, unfortunately, I can give you like 50 examples, but I think this is the one that perhaps will personalize, humanize, and dramatize what the situation is between commissioners and the staff. You have a lot of people on the staff who are passionate and devoted to religious freedom. Unfortunately, you also have some people on staff that are bureaucrats and they're devoted to keeping their job. And that means that taking risks is not something that they want to do. And certainly having commissioners go out there and create work for them is something that they don't want to do. So Senator Harry Reid's appointee, whose name is Sandy Jolly, and she's no longer on the commission, her term wasn't renewed, and I am Speaker Ryan's appointee, were slotted to go to Turkey in 2017. And we went to State Department, we had several briefings, not a single person mentioned the name of Andrew Brunson. As you know, Pastor Andrew Brunson is someone who pastored a church in Izmir, Turkey for 23 years. He was detained and then arrested by Erdogan after 18 months of being incarcerated. The prosecution called for him to spend 35 years in prison, essentially the rest of his life. He was accused of being a spy and he became subject to hostage diplomacy. At the time, he was an unknown pastor and an unknown prisoner. So Sandy and I received all briefings. No one mentioned Andrew Brunson. I happened to run into a friend at the Department of State in the hallway. She said, I heard you're going to Turkey. What are you going to do about Andrew Brunson? She told me about him. Sandy and I, Democrat and Republican, insisted on going to see him in prison. The USCIRF staff didn't want us to go. The State Department people said he's in prison because he's an American, not because he's a pastor. You shouldn't go. We prevailed. We were the first Americans, aside from his wife and the embassy staff, that were able to meet with him. And we were able to publicize his case. When we met with Andrew in the Turkish prison, by the way, I was strip searched on the way in. I had never had that experience before. It was super fun. When we met with him, his biggest fear was to be forgotten. And commissioners from USCIRF were able to advocate for him. But this was in spite people at USCIRF, in spite people for State Department. Some people at USCIRF told me that because he was an American and we were an international commission, we were not to advocate for him. Luckily, commissioners, Democrat and Republicans, voted in favor of advocating for him. And we were able to support his case until he was not released. He was found guilty, but there was a commissioner present at the time who flew back with him to freedom to the United States. And none of this is possible under the new bill. Commissioners will be subject to, whenever there are disagreements with staff, the staff can press charges against any commissioner.
That's crazy. I mean, John and I have seen, and Kristina, you've probably seen in the past, efforts to amend USCIRF in such a way that it hamstrings their work and kind of messes with the model. But this is especially unique, even though I've seen this iteration 2 or 3 times. This is the idea that a commissioner could be sued over this stuff.
Essentially, it's trying to bring the bureaucracy of the U.S. government into the commission and exert authority over it. I mean, something that I know that Matthew's been trying to do. He's saying he's now are you going to start putting revisions on our dialogue so that you can put sanctions on me?
Right, exactly.
and I will adopt you as a prisoner of conscience, John, if that happens. I think freedom of speech. Look, the idea that we are such feeble creatures that we cannot stand disagreement, that no one can speak to us about something that we may disagree on, this is going to make us into morons. Anne Lamott, the Christian writer, said something along these lines: my mind is like a bad neighborhood where I would rather not be alone. I don't want to be alone in my mind all the time. And unfortunately, the bureaucrat fears disagreement. The bureaucrat fears innovation.
Yeah.
And I'm allergic to bureaucracy, but I'm even more allergic to being silenced. I will not allow anyone to be silenced. This doesn't mean that you can be rude, right, but certainly silencing works against freedom. I mean, Elie Wiesel said, silence only benefits the oppressor. You have to take sides on these issues. And if you sit on your hands, silence becomes a form of complicity. And unfortunately, at the commission, I see that all the time. Look, thank you for doing a podcast. This is the way that people talk to each other now, and people find out about issues, and people have discussions. ISIS and USCIRF were started 12 months apart. How come the bad guys are so good at technology that in the last 11 months, ISIS had 2 million mentions and USCIRF had less than 2,000? How come the bad guys are much better in technology than the good guys?
Yeah. Goodness gracious, Kristina.
Yeah, I mean, they stay on mission. They communicate. They're talking. They can say what they want, and there's a freedom in the broadcast. Like we this. I appreciate the mention of us right now. It's how come we're the first Muslim Christian podcast? That was one of the comments we had. We in our conversations earlier. It's because we're afraid. There's a fear of keeping something going, having a long-term commitment to innovation, and even Matthew and I, when we started this thing, we talked about how we've been talking about for 10 years, and we were nervous about it. We go, what do you think is going to happen? We didn't know if his tribe was going to revolt or my tribe was going to revolt, and still we're muddling through. But I think it's worth mentioning that the fear of innovation, the fear of dialogue, the fear of public discourse on a regular basis, not just a one-off panel, is really important. It's an important innovation that you mentioned in an article I read about you just before we got on the podcast, about how innovation, journalism, media, and you were touting on the VOA and how important it was. It's strange, and I think it's very, very it's very meaningful when you turn around and you cite those numbers about ISIS and USCIRF. That's a problem.
Yeah. It's also a problem, John, because in the kinds of meetings I have had with both State Department and USCIRF, there's a lack of religious literacy, right? So a lot of Americans still think, unfortunately, that anyone with a turban is a Muslim, right? And in spite of 9/11, in spite of raising awareness about the Sikh religion. And religious literacy needs to be something that we bring into the schools and we bring into the Foreign Service. And actually part of the Frank Wolf Act, which was something that was passed last year, mandated the Foreign Service to have a level of religious literacy. I must say I'm quite shocked that this is the first podcast of a Christian and a Muslim talking to each other. And I do hope that you're able to continue expanding this conversation, because it is vital to our country as a pluralistic nation, and it is vital for the world to not only have a sense of walking in each other's shoes when it comes to issues, but to have basic religious literacy to know, forgive me for saying this, that not all Muslims are terrorists. Not all Christian evangelicals are boring.
Whoa. That hasn't been disproved at all. All right, let's just start with Dave there.
Sorry, that was awesome. I wasn't sure where you were going with that, Kristina. That's awesome.
I agree with you with religious literacy. I taught at FSI, Foreign Service Institute, for 3 years. I was originally hired to do Islam in a Afghan context or a ex context, Iraqi context, and we would have classrooms of 100, 150 people, 110 people. And so a lot of these are career people. So it'd be from diplomats to military. And I started talking about Islam in an Afghan context, and people were like, well, what's Islam? So then I had to develop an Islam 101 course. And then in that Islam 101 course, I started talking about Abrahamic faiths, and they were like, what's that? So I had to come up with an Abrahamic faiths course. And I was scratching my head going, how are these people career diplomats deployed all over the world, going to, Jeddah, going to Saudi Arabia and Bangladesh and all, well, then Nepal, and they have no idea just basic, Abrahamic faiths, what they are, let alone the core tenets and what's happening and who the players are, and this is not, I mean, I've been doing this 20 years, but this was back in, I'm trying to think, like 2010, 2011 to 2014. And we're talking career diplomats, career military, and the people that were most receptive were the U.S. military. They were the most receptive to it because they're not only boots on the ground, but they're dealing directly with faith communities and not bunkered in the embassies and at their desks. So, but religious literacy is really important, and I think that people get scared when you say that because everybody says, well, you're going to try to convert or you're trying to. It's just like knowing something else that's putting people in situations in the context, and it makes all the difference.
Yeah, and to some of Kristina's point, it doesn't so much shock me about the illiteracy of State Department necessarily, but it does shock me at this point in time, right? Just like what you just laid out, John, but it's also after voices like Madeleine Albright said this is a problem. And regardless of your politics, when Sean Casey was there under John Kerry with the Religious Affairs group, and the IRF office has looked different across the past 20 years, but the IRF office has been around for 20 years now in the State Department, and yet the level of not only religious literacy, that's a big part of it, but I think it's a willingness to recognize your own religious illiteracy, like I try to do here, and be willing to have that conversation. And so that's what's enabled this podcast, quite frankly, is I think John and I both had a willingness to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Tell me more, right? Some level
we generally disagree, but the problem is we're not disagreeing on this one, but we generally disagree, but at least we still come back to each other and figure out what's happening, right?
Right.
But disagreement is a key factor for disruptive innovation, and we should not be afraid of it. I mean, we all come at this with the idea that we're working towards the same goal, which is understanding, interfaith dialogue, and reiterating the importance of freedom of religion or belief, or religious freedom to others, and to be inspired. One of the most inspiring stories I heard before I went on to the commission was the story of Bill Browder, who essentially has changed the world of human rights by demanding accountability to Russia and to Putin, because Putin's thugs murdered his 37-year-old lawyer. And are you familiar with the story? With Bill Browder? Yeah. So Bill Browder is a hedge fund manager who is a multimillionaire, and essentially the Putin regime wanted to steal $230 million from him. So his lawyer, who was 37 at the time, said, look, I can handle this within the judicial system in Russia. The lawyer was incarcerated and essentially tortured to death and murdered. And as a hedge fund manager, this man, Bill Browder, drops everything he's doing just to ensure that there's accountability. And as a result, Congress drafts the Global Magnitsky Act, which is now the Global Human Rights Accountability Act, under which, for instance, if a despot country like China or Russia is saving money in the United States can freeze their assets. It's being a magnificent form of accountability. And this is what commissioners at USCIRF were supposed to be. They were supposed to use their talent, expertise, and connections in order to ensure that human rights, religious freedom in particular, was protected all over the world. And those discussions cannot happen unless someone like Bill Browder comes in and continuously pushes the door. I talked to Bill Browder a few weeks ago in Congress, and I explained to him my frustration of having the bureaucrats at the Department of State and at USCIRF not move forward with innovation. And he said, look, it's like this all over the world. You just have to push forward. The future of disruption and innovation and human rights accountability depends on people that are willing to do what you're doing. Create a podcast so we can have these conversations. People who are willing to engage where the fight is. The fight right now for democracy and freedom, religious freedom, is in technology and in social media. The Chinese are using facial recognition technology that we, the United States, developed in order to suppress the rights of Muslims and Christians. How did that happen? How did we allow the Department of Commerce to promote a U.S. company to the Chinese government so that they could sell their services to use facial recognition. So this is why human rights and religious freedom, it's something that has to be discussed across the board in every single government agency, not only the Department of State, not only in Congress, and certainly not only at USCIRF.
The story about the Chinese and the facial recognition software, the technology coming from the U.S. is absolutely stunning to me.
We've had those problems with companies still serving the Chinese government, and we still are talking about how to address companies that do business with totalitarian regimes, and we still haven't reached an agreement on how we should deal with them. It speaks to the bureaucratic elements about stunting a core freedom and founding principle of our country, which is we're supposed to be projecting all over the world. So all right. So the Kristina, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute. So we got this bill, and it's broadening the mission, which dilutes the purpose and intent and abilities of USCIRF. And then we've got this other element where it's creating a more bureaucratic structure so staff can intervene and really put an umbrella over the commissioners. Tell us this, like, your sexiest, like a really big win while you were a commish, and what's something that's really positive from your experience coming out of it, where because you talked a little bit about bipartisan and everything else. I mean, is the release of Pastor Brunson, or what's the commission look like when it's running efficiently and it's running or inefficiently to the point where it makes a difference?
Thank you so much for asking me that question. As a problem solver, I tend to focus on the areas that need problem solving rather than on the areas that do not. I had magnificent, inspiring experiences as a commissioner. And I must say that when I realized I had to resign, I was heartbroken because the privilege of working with people who are suffering because of religious persecution is you meet the most amazing heroes you'll ever want to meet. You meet ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things. So yes, one of the highlights was walking into that prison interrogation room and seeing Andrew Brunson, who had lost 50 pounds, who was a shadow of a man that I had seen in pictures. And for him to sit there and weep and say, I don't want to be forgotten. And I remember thinking, what can I do? I'm a volunteer commissioner with no policy-making power. And I remembered that Andrew speaks Spanish because his parents were missionary in Mexico. So I talked to him in Spanish, and I said, my father suffered from debilitating depression when he had to leave Cuba and his homeland. And he was in exile in Puerto Rico, and he was hot and muggy, and he didn't have any money, and he had 3 little kids. And he decided that all he had to do was take one step at a time. And in Spanish, it's called paso a paso. And he said he would get up in the morning, and all he focused on was making it to the sink. And he would then brush his teeth, and then he would only focus on the next step, which was getting dressed and ready to go. And he endured the terrible depression that came from being exiled by doing that, paso a paso. Well, I didn't think Andrew was listening or receptive because he was so distraught, but he wrote me from prison several times using those words, paso a paso. So humbly, my humble contribution to that visit, he told me later in person, had sustained him through some pretty dark moments. And what a great story to hear, and what a great person to meet. I met women in Saudi Arabia who were fierce about defending their rights there, about getting rid of guardianship. These were women that were Western educated, had law degrees from top tier schools in the United States and the UK, and they wanted to go back to their country to reform it from within. And I also met people who had survived incredible things, torture in prison, had told me that they had felt God's presence in every corner of their cell. And all those stories inspired me to continue in the fight and actually to resign. I was on the fence of whether or not I should do this or not. The week that Vladimir Bukovsky died, he was a Russian who had been in prison several times because he was a dissident and he was tortured. He wrote a great book called To Build a Castle. And the fact that he was able to go to prison so many times and stand up for he was right. And I thought, I'm being such a wimp by not doing what is right. I didn't want people to hate me. I didn't want my own party to be mad at me because I had given up by leaving the Republican-controlled commission. Now it's 4-4, so they no longer control the commission. I didn't want the Democrats to think that I was, I don't know, standing up for what was right with somehow being proud. But then I remembered that fierce woman in Saudi Arabia and Andrew talking to me in prison. And I thought the worst thing that can happen is that this is going to be politically not expedient, but I'm going to my air-conditioned home to plug in my iPhone and to eat a meal. And those are all things that many people around the world have given up in order to defend this right of religious freedom. So the reason I resigned was to call attention to the bill. The reason I resigned was to push back on the bureaucracy. And I don't know if I'll be successful or not, but this I knew, that I couldn't sit in my hands and remain silent, because that silence in my mind was a form of complicity. We all come in alone into this world. We all leave alone. I'm going to have to live with my decisions in my old age and when I die. And I didn't want to be on my deathbed and regret that I didn't step up to the plate to defend the people that are going to suffer because of this bill.
When I was at the American Islamic Congress, we led the NGO civil society campaign against to reauthorize USCIRF, because it was so important for the survival of USCIRF, even though there was a lot of criticisms of it. But you have our podcast at disposal. If you want me to make a sandwich board and have Matthew walking on Cap Hill, I'm all for that. So I know the three of us all believe in it. So let's utilize our platform to springboard this protest that you've started. And I think it's important for us to kind of operationalize some of this, where we can put up the issue and can get the word out. And even though we have a small constituency, this makes a good podcast. And what do you think there, Matthew?
I think we've utilized Kristina's time long enough. Is there any other question we haven't said, or anything you want to pen to your remarks so far?
We're at an inflection point in the world. We see China putting Muslims, estimated 2 to 3 million Muslims, in concentration camps. China, which was also supposed to be by 2030 the country with the largest Christian population in the world, has been repressing Christians since 2016 in savage ways. We see the island of Cuba. I mean, our own U.S. government is giving visas to the communist government official who represses religious groups in Cuba. She comes here to shop and to visit her family, but pastors who want to attend a theological conference in the United States are not allowed to leave Cuba. All of these people who are repressed and suffering because of the religious beliefs depend on USCIRF. They depend on the Department of State to lift their stories so that they can be advocated for. The State Department has been tremendously innovative, and for the first time in American history has held 2 meetings at the minister level to address religious freedom alone. The ambassador at large for religious freedom, Sam Brownback, has done an incredible job partnering with non-government organizations. We're going to have over 100 religious freedom roundtables around the world. So USCIRF needs to move to the 21st century, engage people where they are fighting for their rights, that is in social media and in technology. And the Senate needs to recognize that the idea of 9 independent disruptive commissioners was a genius idea, and that they must continue to lead the staff of USCIRF rather than have to ask for permission slips to even attend a meeting. I'm greatly hopeful because I have great hope in the American people and great hope in our system that USCIRF will not only survive but thrive, and the independence of USCIRF will continue so it can continue to be a government watchdog.
Beautifully said, Kristina. Your conversation is as I had hoped and anticipated. Thank you for taking the time to be on Crossing Phase.
I don't know. You said you were nervous that a Cuban and a New Yorker were going to be on a podcast with a boring evangelical.
Well, to be fair,
so well behaved. I'll be honest with you, so well behaved.
I did not say nervous. I just said I was going to have my work cut out for me for keeping our conversation focused. But you two did very well. I didn't have to like pull us back from too many rabbit trails. So this was good. You guys nailed it.
Yeah, we didn't get on too crazy, but really appreciate your time and really appreciate the thoughtfulness of your words. When it comes to religious freedom, it's such an ambiguous thing, and you've succinctly sort of brought it in and grounded it with real stories that are meaningful about how the commission is effective and what it means to not only Americans but the world. So I really appreciate your time, Kristina. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Crossing Phase with Matt Hawkins and John Penna, a podcast of Roll Top Productions. If you like what you hear and would like to help defray the cost of the show, consider sponsoring us on Patreon by visiting crossingphase.com. Crossing Phase is available on all your favorite podcast outlets, including iTunes, Google Podcast, Overcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and TuneIn. We'd appreciate your review of our program, especially in the iTunes store. Let us know what you think of the show via Twitter @MTHawk, @JTPenna, or @CrossingPhase. Music for this episode is courtesy Vajra, whose music is available at thevajratemple.com, Spotify, iTunes, and Amazon. Show notes for this episode and more are available at crossingphase.com.